All right, everybody, we are back. We're live on for those who are looking for us. We're live on YouTube and Facebook. I've posted the links at Facebook and at forgeoffreedom.com. And as you can see, if you're watching already, we are here with David Yamane, who is, of course, professor of sociology at Wake Forest. Was actually recently on the Forge of Freedom podcast to talk about his book, Gun Curious, specifically one chapter. It was chapter 8 of Gun Curious about being responsibly armed. David, it's great to see you in person and to be back to chat with you again.
Yeah, thanks so much, and great to see you again and to have a chance to chat with you this time. And this is what an amazing setup this is that the NRA has done for people to live broadcast from the show.
We've had a great time so far, and we certainly appreciate you coming by. We know your time is great.
That's questionable. I appreciate you having me.
Well, you have in previous years on a number of occasions spoken during the lunch at the NRA legal seminar. That's on Fridays. And that's actually how we became acquainted with your work. You spoke at the luncheon during the NRA legal seminar in 2019 in Indianapolis.
Indianapolis, yeah.
And you introduced us to the concept of Gun 2.0. You still have that blog, I know, Gun Culture 2.0. You wrote the book Gun Curious. And you're now shifting priorities to your Light Over Heat project, which I know you have got a Substack and a YouTube channel for that. But one of the articles that I came across, and the impetus behind inviting you to the studio here, or to the booth, I should say, is to talk about what you're looking for here at the NRA annual meeting. I know that you're sort of here with eyes wide open, and you're in this transitionary period in your work. What are you looking for, if anything in particular, and what have you seen so far today in your time here?
Yeah. Well, just very brief background, I started my work in about 2011, published my book Gun Curious in 2024, so that was 13 years of sort of journeying through gun culture and trying to learn as much as I could, and really a lot of focus on my own journey and also on Gun Culture 2.0, so defensive gun culture. And with that book kind of behind me, I told myself I'll spend a year promoting the book and doing some summary kind of projects and essays. But now it's been a year, and so I can't just sit back and reflect for the rest of my life. So really, thinking about what's the next stage, how do I continue my work on guns? Do I keep pressing on with the Gun Culture 2.0 concept? Do I work more in sort of trying to foster dialogue between gun rights advocates and gun violence prevention advocates? Or I've actually become pretty interested in some of these Gun Culture 1.0 pursuits. I went hunting for the first time. I noticed
that you went hunting.
January, I had an amazing time. I'm going to talk to the Smith & Wesson Collectors Association in June at their national meeting. So kind of getting the collecting, and certainly, recreational and sports shooting is a huge part of gun culture. So almost thinking about backfilling and, getting a true full spectrum picture of gun culture.
I noted in something I read of yours that there was some discipline required for you to take that step to go hunting, because there was some inhibition on your part to do the hunting thing. Yeah. What was your experience like there? What was different? What did you learn? What was different about that?
Yeah, no, lots of people as I got into guns were like, oh, we should go hunting, I'll take you hunting. And I was always kind of like, oh, thanks. I have to really explore what I'm doing right now. And I was, I really honestly didn't know how I would feel shooting an animal. I certainly, anything that is, any kind of meat I will eat. Game meat, birds, anything, any mammal, humans. But, there's that part of me. I've never killed a living being before. And so I had a little reluctance, but I thought it's a basic hypocrisy to, eat meat, but not be willing to kill for your own food. So it just by happenstance, I was going to a conference in Arizona, and this guy who was an organizer just wrote to me and said, hey, if you're getting in early enough, I'd love to take you quail hunting. And I was like, for some reason, my instant response was just, yes, absolutely, let's do this. Went out, spent a couple hours in the Arizona brush and desert. Every bush there kind of attacks you, like the thorns and other things, and never got a good look at any of the quail because it was late season. I think only the smart ones were still alive, and they're very elusive, this Gambel's quail. Always like flushing behind you to the side. and I just had no idea what I was even looking at. I don't know if you all hunt, but
Yeah.
you know, if you don't hunt, you don't know what you're listening for. You don't know what you're looking for.
Well, I really appreciate the dogs. When I quail hunted or pheasant hunted, it's the dogs that I really enjoy.
Yeah.
The training of the dogs and how they perform.
Yeah, yeah. So anyway, so I don't want to take up too much time, but so after we were doing the quails, we went to look for some ducks that live. You know, they hang out in these basically reservoirs for the irrigation reservoirs. So kind of sneak up on them. The guy really wanted me to kill something that day, like, and so set me up perfectly for a duck. It's about 7 yards away. Flock comes up. I come up with the gun. I take a shot. Nothing falls. I take another shot. Nothing falls. I'm like, how did I just miss 7 ducks from 7 yards away with a shotgun?
Yeah.
It's called adrenaline.
I was like, I couldn't believe I missed. And he was so disappointed that he was like, I couldn't have set it up for you any better.
They'll be
But
happy.
I had an amazing time. They got some ducks, and one of them got a quail. So I was like, I interacted with the dead animal, and I felt like, okay, I can do this. So
Yeah, nice.
I'm definitely looking forward to the next opportunity to go hunting.
Excellent. I know Alex had just talked to David Conte about the NRA, ILA, what they're doing, what they have done, what they want to do. And I know that's one of your concerns about how we effectuate these changes or how they're happening within the government.
Yeah, well, and before we get to that, I want to stick to the hunting point one more time. I didn't actually realize that you'd just gone hunting. See the southern accent coming out. It was appropriate, right? We're in Georgia.
Yeah.
But that seems appropriate because one of the stories you tell is about when you and Sandy met. You saw what was it out in the deer stand?
Yeah,
I
the
believe.
deer stand.
Yeah. Can you tell that story just real quickly?
So I grew up completely outside of gun culture in California, and then just had this blue bubble of sociology and higher education surrounding me. So when it wasn't until I moved to North Carolina, I started to realize that guns existed, but I still didn't know anything about the culture. And so my wife, Sandy, who grew up in the most redneck town in all of North Carolina, we're driving along the highway one time, and I just looked out in this cornfield, and I saw this square, looked like a tree house on 4 legs, the ladder. And I said, Sandy, why would anybody put a fort out in a cornfield? And she looked at me, honestly, like I was from another planet. And she said, that's a deer stand.
Yeah.
And then she had to proceed to explain to me what a deer stand was for. So that's where I was coming from in terms of not knowing anything about guns, gun culture, or hunting.
I tell that story often. I attribute it to you. I don't know if I should, if you want me to or not, but I do attribute it to you. I tell that story because I think I really enjoy the story.
Well, and of course, your journey in gun culture is not over, but I thought that your recent hunting experience, your first hunting experience, sort of bookended your current journey so far, at least.
Yeah. I start the book talking about how I was out with my friends and shooting BB guns, and I shot a bird that I didn't think was possible that I could even hit. And that, the feeling I had there, I'm sure just stayed with me because I was like, I didn't intend to kill the bird.
Yeah.
And so, my reservation about hunting, I think, is pretty deep.
Yeah, right. Well, you are a self-described liberal sociology professor. And as we've alluded to so far, you've been working on this gun culture 2.0 idea, have blogged about it a lot, written about it a lot, written a book, Gun Curious. It's sort of the culmination of those efforts. You started this project, Light Over Heat. And one of the things, at least my perception of it, and I'll have you describe it, is that you're trying to bridge the divide that's often just filled with rhetoric in terms of people who are in favor of gun ownership and gun use and those who are not. And I think you do a fantastic job of doing that. You try to bring light to those conversations rather than heat to those conversations. Is that the idea behind Light Over Heat, or is there something else to it?
I've been blogging for a long time, and I really enjoyed blogging, but blogging has seen better days in terms of readership. I was trying to continue to reach audiences, and I did feel like I'm have this interesting position of spending 42 years of my life outside of gun culture and 12 years of my life deeply involved, and sort of seeing kind of both sides. Like, I understand why people don't like guns or don't know anything about guns, and I understand why people put a lot of faith in guns and a lot of enjoyment. So I was trying to think, like, how can I act as a sort of mediator between these sides that too often I think just yell at each other. And when I was thinking about launching a YouTube channel, I was talking to John Correa, who's a pretty good person to consult with if you want to try to figure out how to launch a YouTube channel. But he really pressed me like, "What's your mission? What are you trying to accomplish? Like, you're not just putting out videos for the sake of putting out videos." And so I was really thinking like, "What am I about?" Like, well, really promoting light, enlightenment ideas, bringing light to the issue over the heat of argument. And not that there's anything wrong with passion, right? But if it's destructive and not constructive, then I thought that was the issue. So that's where I kind of went with that and that brand. And then that also allows me to kind of talk about other things as well. If someday I don't want to talk about guns, then the brand is not completely tied to that. And I think that's sort of my disposition is trying to get along, trying to understand people that are different from me, and have empathy and curiosity, really.
Yeah. And you and I, in terms of branding, we're looking for similar things. But when I was thinking about how to cast this podcast, The Forge of Freedom, I wanted to capture more than just ideas about guns. And so that's where the Forge of Freedom idea comes from. And that the idea is that, of course, that our rights, our liberties are cultivated from the ground up. They don't come from the government. They don't come from some authority, some human authority at least.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I like the light over heat concept, because it also captures this, what I think you say a lot is you're trying to show that guns are normal and normal people own guns. But I think that message is really for the people who have been at least anti-gun to some degree.
Yes.
But I think your work also does a great job showing people who are already ingrained in gun culture what those people are concerned about. So I think it goes both ways, and trying to foster that conversation. And speaking of that, I came across an article that we want to get into a little bit from your Substack, and I'm going to put that on the screen here so folks can see your Substack. But the article is called "What Am I So Worried About?" And so I want to try to shed some light on what you're worried about rather than heat, and see if we can foster some common ground here, some conversation. Definitely. So let me put this article up on the screen. So again, it's Light Over Heat with Professor David Yamane. It's lightoverheat.substack.com. You've been writing there for, when did you launch the Substack?
Oh, just this spring.
Yeah, so
just a couple months ago.
It's a relatively new project, and so if you're not familiar with it, definitely go check that out. Subscribe so you get an email newsletter, a notification, and follow his writing there. But you start out, you mentioned that you were speaking with two friends, one a Christian conservative, one a libertarian, and you expressed that you had some worry about the way that the Trump administration was going about business, so to speak. And they wondered, why are you so worried? Because these are two people who at least believe that, in theory, that smaller government is better government, right? And so insofar as Trump's efforts are achieving that end, that who cares what the means are? And I'm paraphrasing. I don't know if that's exactly what they said. But so you wrote this article sort of in response to that interaction, that commentary.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what you mean? What are you worried about?
Yeah. Well, and I hope that the essay was written in the same spirit of Light Over Heat, in the sense that these are two people that I consider friends, right? And they think they're asking me what I was worried about was an expression of their concern, because they could see that I was, upset and in some distress about the way things were happening in these first couple of months of the Trump administration. And so I wanted to respond to their concerns, and also to recognize that their concerns may not be my concerns, and that we can differ about whether this is good or bad, but at least I wanted to outline my concern. And so I think a lot of my concerns really revolve around sort of dismantling of the state, for lack of a better word, the federal bureaucracy, but then also at the same time consolidating power around the president. And so I talk about this unitary executive which I've gotten a lot of response to that, which is basically saying that's just what the Constitution says. And I'm like, okay, well, if we could all just read the Constitution, then there wouldn't be a need for any court system to tell us what the Constitution actually says. And what we think the Constitution says changes over time. I mean, look at gun rights, right? I mean, what we thought the Constitution said on gun rights is not what we currently think. So the way the consolidation of power around the president, and also sort of eliminating checks on that, the fact that I think Congress hasn't really stepped up to do its job as, the Article 1 branch of government.
Which is not a new development, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we have seen that sort of deference or delegation of authority for quite some time, really.
Yeah.
But I think that you're right. We're still seeing it even with the current administration, maybe even more so in some ways.
So this is, I think, a question, and I think people have, pushed back friendly way, or, just engaging in dialogue with me to say like, hey, guess what? This has been happening for some time. This is not new. And, in part I have to plead guilty because I've been busy doing other things. I haven't really, been paying much attention. It also hasn't hit me at home as much as this currently has with some of the defunding of federal higher education. But I think for me, it still seems sort of qualitatively different, even though, you go back, you see Jimmy Carter signed lots of executive orders, right? Bill Clinton signed lots of executive orders. So, there's some dynamics that are like a trend, but then it just feels to me, and maybe inappropriately, that there's been a qualitative shift since Trump was inaugurated.
Well, I like. Go ahead.
It's kind of interesting because I've had similar experiences to yours of late with colleagues of mine, for instance. And I've had some uneasiness as well with regard to executive power. But I'm in the learning stage still. I'm an attorney. I can read the Constitution. But I'm sort of in the learning stage, and that's why I'm so interested in hearing what you have to say about this. Because, sometimes we talk about the 4 stages of learning. I think I'm in the conscious incompetence area when we talk about the unitary executive power, because I think you're right. It's clear, and I've got the concept brought it up in front of me. I mean, the vesting clause clearly puts executive authority in the president, but there can be a debate, and reasonable people can disagree about how strong that executive authority can be. Yeah. Is it minimalist or is it maximal? Yeah. And that's, I think, where most people are at.
The power is vested in the president, but only pursuant to the executive powers, to the powers that are vested in the president by the Constitution. But one of the things that I like the way you described it, and this gets back to your qualitative point, you said Donald Trump was sworn in as president of the United States and began acting at muzzle velocity to flood the zone with executive orders and action. And I think that's partly what you're getting at, right, when you're talking about the qualitative and the quantitative, speed and number of executive orders that he's issued. But one of the things, as I was reading your article, and I want to drill down on this, is because I think we have common ground here in terms of what is the role of government, because you talk about sharing concern about the national deficit, the debt, and the burden that has. What is the role of the president? And you talk about how the ends don't justify the means. So if you would unpack what you mean by that and how you view the role of government versus what you're concerned about with President Trump's executive actions.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that we either need to be taking in more money or spending less money or both, right? I mean, that's something that I think we can all agree on. It's, how do we get to that point? And is going in and saying we're basically going to shut down the Department of Education. I'm going to defund all of this research that's being done by the National Institute of the Humanities, and Musk proudly wielding the chainsaw. That I just feel like this is not the ideal way to accomplish this goal of reducing that federal debt. And so,
how do you respond to the critique? And I know you've thought about this, that Congress has taken no action toward this. They appear to have no desire to reduce the federal deficit. So if President Trump doesn't do it, who's going to do it, and who's going to prevent the collapse of our democratic republic?
Yeah, no, I don't have the answer to that question. I think if we had that answer, then it would be a lot easier to move forward. I think that we see, even with what the president is doing, people are all trying to find their carve out, right? Like, and all of a sudden, your congressman's like, wait, we're going to lose what? We're going to lose our VA hospital? Like, whoa, 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 this is getting a little bit too far. And so, I think that whole issue is just endemic on both sides of the aisle, really. And I don't know the answer, but I feel like he could have accomplished some of the same goals by moving more deliberately and not, we're going to lay off these employees. They do nuclear security. Sorry, come on back. And I think also, maybe the liberal in me is like, federal civil servants have certain job rights, right? And you can't just come in and say you're fired and make up you're being fired for cause when, that's just clearly not true. And so, the other part of this sort of worry has to do with the due process, that I think that, people have, rights, whether we're talking about, immigration, deportation, whether you can be fired from your job or not. I had a student of mine who worked for the U.S. Institute of Peace, which is not even part of the executive branch. And, the Musk went in with some law enforcement officers, took over the building and fired all the employees. And I'm like, how is that even happening? Mm-hmm. So, I think that's where, like, the centralization of power, if it means less due process, that's also a worry.
Let me.
One of the things that I think about, I try to examine, am I too worried about some things? I mean, worry most of the time, and I'm not a psychologist.
Neither am I.
But one of the problems with worry, I think, is that we have worries about whatever it is, and statistically, the probabilities of those bad things coming to fruition is phenomenally low. So sometimes I wonder if I worry too much about the minutia of what degree of due process we need to apply to a particular situation, or what degree of unitary power does the president have. Am I worrying too much about it?
Yeah, well, there's similarities. I'm a very risk averse person. Yeah. When I think about, what's the likelihood that I'm going to need a gun to defend myself? It's extremely low, given my lifestyle. I see John Farnham's right across the way, so don't go stupid places and do stupid things with stupid people. That works a lot of the time. So I think some of that, thinking about what's the worst that can happen, that maybe comes a little more natural to me. I had, lunch with a good friend just today because he was worried about me being so worried. And he said, what, it's going to be fine. It'll be fine.
Well, I think that happens to an academic. And also, I think we suffer from that somewhat as attorneys as well, that we worry about things that maybe we are overreacting sometimes. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know.
It's a question, not an answer.
Yeah. In terms of worry, coming back to the due process issue, and I get a lot of flack because I consider myself to be a libertarian, and I get a lot of flack from Trump supporters about some of my commentary. But I'm also concerned about due process because, well, just think about guns for a moment. There's this famous clip of him where he says, take the guns now and due process later, referring to red flag laws and emergency risk protection orders. But then more recently, with the immigration debate, it's another issue where due process has been at the forefront. People are like, well, they're here illegally. And I said, well, the Constitution doesn't say that it has to be a citizen, that, it says person. And I caution the people who are for that person's deportation against being so cavalier about due process because the Constitution requires it, but it also, by just deporting the person, for instance, you're also basically saying that if you're okay with the government identifying who does and who doesn't get due process. And I think that that's a dangerous precedent to set. And maybe that's something that I'm too worried about, but I think it puts the machinations in place for violations of individual liberty and human rights when you're saying we're going to allow executive authorities to decide who does and who doesn't get due process. And I think that just goes against fundamental notions that we have about what people are entitled to in terms of being able to present a defense, being able to cross-examine witnesses, and all those sorts of things that are built into the law.
No,
The question-
please.
but if you're, and I'll push back a little bit. But if the immigration problem is so monumental, if that issue is so monumental, should we stop the solution to that problem because of this
Due process.
because of this due process issue that you've identified that many legal scholars might not think is a due process issue?
Yeah. Well, draw the parallel again with the red flag laws, right? Is that due process, you're basically taking away the liberty interest, you're taking away the property of the person before they get any due process. And that's a concern that many gun owners have about red flag orders. Here, you are forcefully detaining a person, forcefully extricating them from the country, and that certainly implicates a liberty interest, a property interest, and I think requires due process. I get that people disagree, but I think this gets to your concern about, right, the sort of precedent that we're setting about consolidating this sort of authority in the executive and at the same time ignoring other constitutional protections like due process.
Yeah.
Is that a fair?
Yeah, and it's interesting because, I feel like in many ways my political views have been very consistent over my entire lifetime. It's just kind of a center-left liberal. But the thing that I've learned in my time in gun culture, and this I think came from both people more on the right and more on the left, to the right of me and to the left of me, I'd say, is you just trust the government too much. And so I think some of that is now coming to fruition because, an administration that I am sort of less inclined to trust to begin with, and then doing things that sort of makes me feel a little bit less trustful also. So I have to thank my time in gun culture for making me more skeptical of centralized power. But yeah, I had an interaction with someone online, which is not always the greatest thing, but it was a friend of mine. And he said, I really don't have any sympathy for this guy who's been deported, whose name I'm blanking on right now. And I said, that's probably the most important person to make sure that their rights are secured, right? The person that we don't have sympathy for. And I mentioned, this case, the Rahimi case that went to the Supreme Court.
Yep.
I met the federal public defender who was in charge of his case, who brought the case, and he's like, he's a terrible person. He's absolutely a criminal. And he was definitely going to jail under state laws, and there didn't need to be all of these additional federal charges, right? Mm-hmm. And because, by fighting for this terrible person, but on behalf of all the people who aren't terrible, who could be subject to that injustice.
No matter who's in power.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the thing that I think so many, whether it's the left that's in the executive, that's in power in the executive branch, or the right, you don't want the mechanisms in place for that person to be able to exercise the discretion to deprive you of due process or other rights that you have, either naturally or pursuant to the Constitution.
Yeah.
And I think that's the point that so many people miss in this debate, whether it's the immigration debate or others, is that you don't want the government to have that authority and that sort of arbitrary authority vested in the executive to say, we don't like this person, they're a bad dude or a bad gal, and so we're going to deprive them of due process and just make the determination ourselves.
Yeah.
I think it just illustrates the point that we all have to guard against this. The means are justified by the ends. If we like the result, we always have to be testing ourselves. Are we being honest about what happened before that result? And that's probably more important than the result in most cases.
Because the people who are supportive of Trump today, rightly or wrongly, have to be satisfied that if the person they don't like gets elected in 2028, they may exercise that same sort of authority in a way they don't like. And so my point, and I think part of your point, is that we don't want that mechanism in place to begin with.
Yeah. And, to your point about what, these stages of learning, I hopefully wrote this piece in the spirit of just trying to explain myself, but also I'm not an expert in any of those issues. And I'm typically very reluctant to write about things that I don't have some expertise in, because I respect people who do have expertise. But, and also I'm learning also, as people respond to me in this, and I learn things like, hey, maybe move towards more executive power has been going on longer than you think. Go back and check. And so I went go back and check. I was like, holy, if you look at executive orders per year, I mean, I think it's Carter, Clinton, Reagan, Trump, or something like that. But it's not like Democrats haven't used the executive order.
Yeah, exactly. But of course, from a logical standpoint, I'm not sure that justifies continuing the expansion.
So the point that was made to me was like, where were you 20 years ago worried about executive power when the Democrats were doing it? And I was like, fair point. Like I wasn't, I don't notice it as much. I wasn't I don't know that I complained at all through the first Trump presidency, so it's not like I've just been complaining about Trump. I actually posted right after he was elected, which was a surprise to me, as to many people on the left, sort of 10 expectations or 10 hopes for the Trump presidency, because I thought, hey, he won fair and square. Let's see how it goes. So, I haven't had a grudge to bear against Trump for 12 years now. It's like I literally think he came out of the gates with much more of a plan to just disrupt things, and he succeeded. He disrupted me for sure.
Well, I think it's important to understand, and I'm certainly no expert on executive unitary power, but I think it's a fair statement to say that, I mean, I've read Scalia. He was a strong believer in that unitary power. I've read Roberts, what he said. There's a lot of room for debate about what the Constitution says about that power. I mean, we can pick apart. I was reading the Constitution before we started it, and you can pick it apart and say whatever you want about that argument. There's ambiguity there, I think, for sure.
Yeah, no, and that, it's been, I think great. I went back, I read the Declaration of Independence. When was the last time I read the Declaration of Independence? I read the Constitution over. Like, wow, that was. I mean, you have to have a law degree. It's not like you can just read that. It's like very convoluted, but it was good. Like to get back and say, like, okay, maybe one response is let's get back to the foundations. Like, what do we stand for? As a nation. How did the founders construct this document as a way of reconciling competing interests and diversity? The same issues we're facing today, those were concerns they had then, and it's been working pretty good. And I hope it continues to work. And maybe, we see, like, I'm less worried now. I can't remember how many weeks ago I wrote that, but I feel less worried now than I did when I wrote it, although I'm not unworried. Yeah. But I think now we're seeing some of those sort of checks coming in and, slowing down the process.
Please. Do you have any concerns about what the Article 3 branch, the judiciary, is doing? I mean, there are two concerns there I guess you could talk about. Number one, there's probably been 15 or 20 restraining orders saying President Trump, you can't do A, you can't do B, you can't do C. Do you have concerns that the judiciary is exerting too much authority, too much power, so that it's inhibiting the functions of the executive in terms of trying to fix some of the problems we have, like the debt? Is that a problem? Are they stepping out of bounds?
Yeah. I think maybe because they're going in a direction that I prefer. I don't shift. No, it's a great question that I have heard again in response to this piece. People saying like, hey, I don't know that it was the founders' idea that we would have all of these regional federal judges who had the ability to make law or enforce or interpret law that affects everybody in the country. And that's something I honestly had never thought about.
And it's interesting, too, because Alex and I were talking about this. We love a federal district judge in Texas who enters a TRO that precludes the ATF from enforcing a rule nationwide because we like the result.
Right.
Do we like a judge in New Jersey? I don't know. In New Jersey who says, Trump, you can't do this, when we don't like the activity that's precluding. So
I want to come back to this example. So there was a district court judge who issued an injunction with respect to ATF rulemaking and enjoined the federal government from enforcing their rule nationwide. And so the question was, does the judge in the district court in Texas have the authority to join the government outside of his jurisdiction. And many gun owners cheered for that. But I think this gets back to our point earlier, is that sets the precedent. Then they have to be satisfied that it's okay for a district court judge in New Jersey, for instance, saying that we're going to enjoin the government from prohibiting abortion. And we're going to do that nationwide, for instance. And clearly, the people who supported the judge in Texas would ordinarily, in terms of a democratic position, be opposed to that order from the judge in New Jersey. But they've already asserted that we agree with that authority. And so I think that gets back to the point that we don't want government officials acting outside of their specifically prescribed government constitutional authority.
Yeah.
Whether or not you like the result, because eventually somebody who you don't agree with may occupy that position.
Yeah. No, I think this is probably, it's I keep saying educational, but I think it's really educational to get put into a situation where, like, I'm feeling very uncomfortable now. How must it feel for other people when the shoe was on the other foot, right? And so yeah, I think that it's been an amazing process, because I feel great that I have met so many people with whom I disagree, because truly, before I got into gun culture, I was living in an extremely blue bubble, and I still at work I'm mostly in a blue bubble. I live in a red town now, so I can't say, but I used to live in a blue bubble, and really, getting involved with people who see the world differently than me has been, completely to my benefit, and fortunately, I know enough people who don't just fall into the shouting or ad hominem attacks, that it does create a situation where I can say, like, wow, I hadn't thought about that, or I respect your opinion, and so I need to take that information in and work with it and see what I think. So it's I think more people need to. We would benefit if more people did that.
Yeah, I agree, and that's why we wanted to have you on to talk about this from the NRA annual meeting, right? And talk about. I mean, we're being very critical of Trump and the authority that he's exerted. I know that's a lot of your concern. That's our concern as well, to some degree. I may lose half of my subscribers for saying so, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not. I mean, I'll backtrack. I'm still ambiguous about some of it.
Sure. No, I think there have been positive steps taken by the Trump administration, but I think we need to call a spade a spade. And I think we need to be willing to step back from our political ideology to consider the worries, the concerns of the other side. And I think that helps us, as you say, become more educated, to become more empathetic, become more, I think, open to conversation about how to address this in a way that works better for everybody. And one of the concerns I wanted to make sure we talk about, and we're running short on time here, is you mentioned emergency rule. I highlighted that in your article here. Mm-hmm. And this is another example, I think, of where people like the exertion of emergency rule when the person they support is in power, but loathe the exertion of emergency rule when the person they don't like is in power.
Yeah.
And we've seen this with the tariffs. We've seen this with immigration policy. We've seen this with drug policy. We saw this during COVID, for instance.
Yeah.
We see it at state and local level now.
Yeah.
They're adopting
hurricane,
Yeah. And what we've seen is that this has become a common tactic, no matter who's in power, of basically generating a made-up emergency. Occasionally there's a real emergency, but the fact that immigration has been a problem for decades, or that tariffs, trade balance has been a problem for decades, is not all of a sudden an emergency. And I think that sets a dangerous precedent going forward as well. Is that a fair summation of your?
Yeah. No, it's probably more elaborate. As I look what I wrote, it's just about one sentence that I put in there. It's it's suggestive of, like, I feel like that's not a good thing. It's not something that I've studied in depth or that I know a lot about. But I do know, again, I think it's probably not the best test. A great test is to say, again, if the shoe's on the other foot, how are you feeling about that, right? Like when they declare an emergency and say, you can't have guns in public, right? Or whatever the case may be. like, whoa, that doesn't make sense. But if it goes in our favor, then we're like, okay, yeah, that's good. And I don't know how often emergency powers are being declared, but I have been noticing it recently.
More and more, it seems like.
Yeah.
Well, any other comments? I know we talked a little bit. We didn't cover all of your article, of course. Put a link to it in the show notes so people can go and read it for themselves. I just wanted to give us an opportunity to talk through this. And we see eye to eye on some things, but not everything. And I hope that people got something from this conversation.
I think my concluding note is we're 340 million people living on millions of square miles of land mass from all different parts of the world, different religious traditions, ethnic groups, beliefs. There's no way we're all going to agree on everything, right? And so that's fine. We don't have to agree. And again, I think one thing that I've underappreciated, but I'm coming more to appreciate more is that our constitutional system was designed precisely to address this reality, like on a much smaller scale back then, right? But people thought of themselves as citizens of their state, not of this federation.
And the whole idea behind federalism.
Yeah. And so, when it works well, it has the capacity. I hope it is not at a breaking point. Like now we're too big and too diverse for it to work. So I'm hopeful that it can continue to work. And part of my concern is that it seemed like if power shifts too much in one direction, then that has the potential to break the system. And, and I don't know how real it is because it's not, again, one of those things I haven't looked at a lot, but, what power does the Supreme Court have to enforce any of these things if at some point the president's like, too bad, and be like, oh well,
yeah, a great job of providing some thoughts, notions, and context that help us all be more critical thinkers about our own positions. I really do.
Yeah.
Well, Dave, thank you so much for coming back on the show. I really appreciate you stopping by. I know you've got some plans this evening. I hope you have a great rest of the trip down here, and I'm sure we'll be in touch again in the near future.
Yeah, I hope so, and I'm flattered by the invitation to come talk about things that you guys probably know a lot more about than I do.
Oh, well, I don't know that for sure, but
if I had to bet, that's what I would bet.
There are very few people who are willing to sit between two attorneys to talk about these things.
Exactly.
Yeah, but
put things into perspective for the people watching.
Yeah. No, but I appreciate the opportunity and the education, and I look forward to being in touch more over the years.
Well, we appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.
Good. All right, everybody, we're going to take a brief break here. Again, this is David Yamane, professor of sociology at Wake Forest. Gun Culture 2.0, Light Overheat, Gun Curious. Any other resources that people should look to?
No, I think the general place to go for everything I do is davidyamane.com. So
okay, fantastic. davidyamane.com. All right. Well, thanks again, and thanks
thank
everybody
you guys
for tuning in.
Thank you.